in-house information. We have been afforded a seat, which we believe is our inalienable right as young people on the People's Constitutional Commission. We will be represented by Attorney at Law Alia Gomez, and our alternate is Mr. Mandela Wade. And so we have a seat at the discussion table, exactly what we believe we deserve as young people. And we will be sure to make valuable contributions to this most critical process, which we categorize as a generational task. So with no further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Mr. Bradley, and he will be leading us with this conversation for this afternoon. Mr. Bradley, if it's possible, we will have the chat box open where questions will be asked. Would you prefer us to ask questions during the process and engage in conversation, or after?
Well, I actually prefer if you would stop me at any time during the presentation and the persons could just unmute their mic and they could ask their questions. I prefer that it actually be a back and forth and engaging discussion.
Perfect. Well, with no further ado, take it away, Mr. Bradley.
Before we turn it over to Mr. Bradley, I like to do some minor housekeeping. We ask that during the discussion that you keep it objective, 1. Number 2, that we refrain from name calling and calling names during the discussion. So we would prefer that you won't engage in calling people stupid, idiotic, stuff like that. We ask that you please refrain from referring to personalities and that we keep the discussion open and objective. The Constitution, as we learned last week, is a very intensive document and it is the supreme law of the land. And so while we have a seat at the People's Constitution Commission, we want everyone to understand the underpinnings of what the Constitution is, so that when we come to you for consultation, you have an understanding of what we're asking for. That's it for our housekeeping. Without further ado, we now officially turn it over to you, Mr. Bradley.
Good afternoon, participants. First of all, I just want to say it is indeed my pleasure and a sincere honor to have received the invitation from your organization to present on what I believe is a most fundamental topic. The Constitution really is a document about who we are as a people, what are our aspirations, what are our core values as a nation, what do we want to achieve as a community, as a society, as individuals. And it regulates fundamentally the relationship between the citizen, the individual, and the governing authorities, and the relationship between the citizen and other citizens. As you've seen in the presentation, I'm going to get into a few concepts that underpin our understanding of the Constitution. I don't plan on making it too heavy. As I said in the introduction, I want it to be a little bit engaging so that if there are certain areas of the presentation that you find a bit unhelpful, you could just kind of steer me back on course, or if there's certain aspects of the presentation that you want me to go more in depth with, and you want me to provide a little bit more clarification and so forth, or insights, or illustrations, or examples, please feel free to let me know at any time. It's not a problem for me that you interrupt the presentation and you stop and ask me a question. I prefer that you ask the question at that particular time, so I don't forget and I am able to address exactly what you want me to address at the appropriate time, and the presentation can emerge and develop appropriately for your benefit. I'm here primarily to assist you, to share with you a little bit of my experience and my understanding of constitutional law, and to give you a little bit of my insight and really to engage with you in a meaningful way to kind of add to your experience and your knowledge and whatever meaningful work that you're doing in the area of constitutional reform. I want to congratulate your group for embarking on this very noble process. I think the idea of knowledge exchange as it relates to the Constitution is very critical. I believe that our Constitution is a very strong document. It's a document that is solid in terms of its drafting, because it's one of the later constitutions that have been written in the region since we got our independence in 1981, we've been able to develop from other historical documents, human rights documents and other constitutions that have existed both in the English-speaking Caribbean Commonwealth countries, from the European Convention on Human Rights, from other human rights treaties and so forth, so that our constitution, I believe, is a very solid document. And it's a document that can be improved, but it reflects a comprehensive understanding and explanation of fundamental rights and the workings of our democratic system of government. And an understanding and appreciation of this, including a critical review and analysis of this on the part of ordinary citizens, on the part of young people, I think is very important to get us to where we want as a nation. The idea of constitutional reform, the idea of having our constitution continue to emerge as a living, breathing, and complementary document to our democracy is very, very important. In order for us to do so, knowledge exchange and information is very important. Opportunities like what you are doing today is very important. Sharing with young people your understanding of the Constitution, engaging with young people as to what they want to see in relation to changes to the Constitution. In the presentation, you're going to see that I will mention some insights that I have, some recommendations that I have in terms of possible areas of constitutional reform. These are things that you may engage with me on. These are things that we could develop in the presentation. If you have any ideas or areas that you think that you would want to see in terms of changes or improvements, I would definitely welcome an opportunity to engage with you on those this afternoon, to share whatever commentary or insight that I may have to be of assistance. By way of the presentation, I have put together a slide. It's not a very in-depth slide, and it's about 17 different slides. What I'll do is that I will share this with Beresford so that he could share it to members of the group this afternoon. And if you want any other information, articles, documents, guidance, or anything like that for the presentation or to support anything that I've said, feel free to ask and I'll provide that information. Again, if you want to utilize me as any kind of insight or assistance for your organization, I've expressed to Beresford that I am fully prepared to do so. So again, before we get into the meat of the matter, I just want to thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to an engaging discussion this afternoon. I just want to say, just again, before I get in, I'm a lawyer, and by profession, what we do is that we talk. So that's one of the reasons why I want the discussion to kind of go back and forth, and feel free to stop me at any time. I also teach constitutional and administrative law at the University of Belize. I've been doing so for the last, I believe, 3 years. And so some of the information that I've garnered is from my readings and from my presentation in those classes and to other groups. I've had on the slide, I'm sharing my screen, and in terms of the PowerPoint presentation, this is just a brief presentation about my understanding of the constitutional and constitutional theory and the Constitution of Belize. So what I want to do is 2 things this afternoon. Number 1 is I want to discuss the historical and conceptual development of constitutional theory in the Western world. And you'll see that I place this in history. Some of that may not be necessarily relevant to you, or it's not something that's directly germane to Belize, but I kind of find it's important for us to appreciate the history and how written constitutions have emerged in our part of the world, and the importance of those written documents, what they were trying to achieve, the historical context in which those documents emerge, and so that we could assess how effective the document is in actually achieving its stated purpose. The second thing that I want to do is I want to examine the Constitution of Belize and look specifically at certain core principles of the Constitution, how the Constitution was designed, and how effective I believe and how effective you believe our Constitution is to achieving the stated purposes. the first thing that I want to discuss in the slide presentation is just what existed before the Constitution. And again, this is the first part of the presentation that I am doing, which talks about really a historical and a conceptual understanding of the Constitution. Did somebody have a question? Okay, again, so if anybody has a question at any time about the presentation or anything that I've said, feel free to jump on the system and just ask me on the presentation or anything that you want. So let's just kind of frame this in terms of what existed before the Constitution. And I'm around the 17 to the 1800s. So this is about 200 or 300 years ago. A lot of history is there. And again, one of the reasons why I mention this is because I think it's important to appreciate the historical context. It's not necessarily directly relevant to beliefs, but I want you to get a sense of where I'm coming from when I talk about the Constitution. So before the Constitution existed, and we're placing this around the 17 to the 1800s in Europe, and you had a system of absolute monarchs. So you had a system of government which was the dominant governing structure at that time of totalitarian or authoritarian governments. Essentially, they ruled by one person or one group of people, the king or the monarch. And the overwhelming form of government at that time was the absolute monarch, which means that you had a king or queen, a royal family, and an elite that utterly dominated and ruled society. They governed all aspects of society, including every function of government, the economy, the social and cultural norms of society, the legal system. Everything was regulated and dominated by this monarchical system. And under this system, you had immense wealth and power that was concentrated in one central government, with the larger population being poor and marginalized, and with the larger population being devoid of any type of political power or legal rights. One of the things that I like in my personal life is I like to watch history. And one of the things or shows that I used to watch is Henry VIII, which was an HBO show. And one of the things that Henry VIII is known for is beheading several of his wives. He had several of his wives executed. And that show really represented the awesome, tremendous power that was held in the form of the monarch. That you had the prevailing form of government being this monarchical system that was absolute, that was concentrated in terms of its power in the hands of one person, in the hands of the crown. And really and truly, one of the things that I liked with Henry VIII is that he's known for this phrase, off with his head or off with her head. The rule of the monarch was law. The word of the monarch was law. If the monarch did not like you, the monarch could order your execution without trial, without cause, and the majority of people were devoid of any type of political power, any type of economic power, any type of legal rights. Around that time also, at the 17 or the 1800s in Europe, you began to have the Industrial Revolution. And this was a period of history that saw the rise of capitalism. It saw the rise of the merchant class. It saw rapid urbanization, whereby people from rural areas were moving to cities. And there was a tremendous amount of social upheaval at this time. There was a tremendous amount of fervor and discussion going on because society was in a state of flux and in a state of confusion and disarray because you had so much social change being caused as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And this was a period of time when societies began to move from being very agricultural based to being very industrial. You had the steam engine being invented. You had the railways being invented. You had massive mercantilism and commerce emerging. And a lot of new wealth was created, and emerging at this time was the growth of the middle class. So that you had a tremendous amount of economic power now being shared between a middle class and the upper class. And you have what oftentimes is called in movies or writings, new money. You had a lot of people who were new capitalists who emerged with a lot of wealth, and that wealth translated into political power, and they began to question the monarchical system that existed at that time. They began to say that this system of an absolute monarchy was inadequate to regulate and govern our society. And they began to complain and to argue for increased social, political, and economic rights because they had new power as a result of this increased wealth. At the same time, you had a period of human history which is known as the Enlightenment. And I'm going to talk about this in a short while, where you had a lot of philosophers and social scientists who began to write on their explanations and their thoughts of all of this social change. They began to try to use new models of explaining how society should work, including how government should work. And one of the things that emerged at this time, and again, we're around the 17 and the 1800s, is revolutionary fervor. So because of the Industrial Revolution, because of new wealth, because of massive urbanization and massive social upheaval, changes, poverty, a lot of things going on, people began to be increasingly dissatisfied with the governmental structure, which was the monarchy, the king and the queen. They began to feel a sense of themselves, that individualism and individual rights were more the governing thought of the time. And why is it that we have tremendous power concentrating in just a few people? Those people are not providing for our well-being. Those people are not representing our interests. Those people do not speak for us, the king and the queen. And this ignited revolutionary fervor, so that at this time you had a series of world revolutions which are noteworthy. People began to embrace the concept of individualism and individual rights, and they began to repel against the rule of the king, the rule of the queen, the rule of the monarchy. And at this time, you had open revolution. So in France, you had the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was particularly unique because the people took their king and their queen, King Louis and Queen Antoinette, and they actually cut off the king and the queen's head. They took the king and the queen to the guillotine, which was their mode of execution. And they literally took the queen and the king and they destroyed the king and the queen by cutting off their head. And the picture that I'm showing you on the screen is a famous painting of the execution of King Louis. And they cut off his head by the guillotine, the symbol of oppression. And they took his head and they showed his head to the people. So that there was this massive revolutionary fervor that people actually began to overthrow the monarchy. You had that system also in the American Revolution. And in the US Revolution, they overthrew King George of the United Kingdom, and they dispelled the revolutionary or colonial shackles that was on them. And the US entered into a period of the War of Revolution against the British, and they were successful. And 13 colonies of the United States declared their independence in the American Declaration of Independence, and they threw off the shackles of colonialism. You also had the Haitian Revolution, where former slaves overthrew their slave masters in Haiti. And you had Toussaint L'Ouverture, who was a revolutionary figure in Haiti, who was an ex-slave. And he overthrew, together with his compatriots, the slave owning class in Haiti and threw off the shackles of French colonial domination in Haiti. You also had the Glorious Revolution in the United Kingdom, where King William and Queen Mary voluntarily accepted limited government. So there was not a violent revolution in the United Kingdom, but they voluntarily, the king and queen, accepted to be limited by a constitutional tradition. And so at that time in England, it was said, and the rule became that the monarch reigned but did not rule. And they passed power over to Parliament, and Parliament became supreme rather than the government. You also had the Russian Revolution, which came around the period of 1915, where again, the Russian revolutionary leaders executed the king at that time and his entire family. And so this was a period of massive social change where people began to embrace themselves and embrace revolutionary fervor, and they eliminated to a large extent the existing or the dominant form of government, which was the absolute monarch. And let me get a little bit into some of the constitutional thinking or thought at that time. So at that time, you had some of the writers, the social theorists, who were trying to explain what was happening with the Industrial Revolution, the rise of capitalism, a lot of social change that was going on, massive urbanization, and the inability of the absolute monarch, the king and queen, to deal with that. There was a historical saying, I don't know how accurate it is, that at one point, just before the French Revolution, they asked Marie Antoinette, who was the queen at that time, they told her, her ministers told her that the people were starving, they needed bread. And she responded, let them eat cake. I don't know if that's accurate, but that is something that has been reported in novels and in movies about this time period. But the reference, let them eat cake, is an example or an illustration as to how out of touch the kings and queens at that time were of the plight of the people, that they were going through immense poverty, immense social disarray, and the institutions at the time, the governing structures at the time, could not handle it. They couldn't deal with it, and that led to revolution. So you had a writer, Thomas Hobbes, and he wrote one of his thinking or philosophies, psychological egoism, that people are motivated by what they perceive as their self-interests, and that political authority and obligations are based on individual self-interest of members of society who are understood to be equal to one another, with no single individual invested with any essential authority to rule over the rest. So that one of the things that Hobbes was talking about here is that in society, there's fundamental equality. That's a radically new concept at the time that did not exist. So before, you had the principle of the divine right of kings, that the kings and queens felt that it was their divine right. There's a reference in the Bible that talks about human beings should subject themselves to the governing authority. And the kings and queens at the time used that to say that it is my divine right. I'm ordained by God to rule over the people. And if I abuse and I exploit or I execute the people, that's my will, because I am the king and I shall not be questioned. My word is law. But at the time, these social scientists, these philosophers like Hobbes were saying, no, no, that's not accurate. People are endowed with fundamental equality, and each of us are self-interested, and each of us have the right to maximize our own self-interest, and no individual, no authority, no government, no state has the right to rule over any individual. The principle or the rule of law is individual liberty, which each and every one of us are endowed with. So Hobbes saw that human beings were rational, and human beings made rational choices. And he and others came up with this idea of social contract theory. And this is actually a revolutionary notion at the time. But what Hobbes is saying, and they're saying different things, and they're talking about different human assumptions. But essentially, what social contract theory is, it's the notion that individuals in society who are rational self-interested individuals who are free-thinking, they choose to submit by their voluntary consent to the governing authority of a state because they recognize that they need government for certain things. So that government is not something that exists as a result of a monarch. Government certainly is not in something that exists by virtue of nature. Government does not exist by divine right or divine law, including this notion of the divine right of kings. Government exists as a social construct. We are free-thinking individuals. We're endowed with liberty and intellect and rationality and free will, and individuals through this idea of social contract theory can think for themselves, and individuals rationally would recognize that government is a necessary thing, that we need a legal structure, that we need a market system, that we need a court system, that we need a police force, that we need a defense force. And so what Hobbes and the other theorists who are writing at this time are saying is that human beings voluntarily give their consent to being governed. And the government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, not the reverse. So it's not that a king and queen has some divine right to rule, it's that the government is a social construct and the government devises its authority from the consent of the governed through this notion of social contract theory. So because we want a peaceful society, because we want cooperation, because we want to further our individual ends, we create a social construct known as government. And we as citizens give that government certain rules, certain procedures, certain authorities, and we as a citizen voluntarily limit our rights. And we agree to be governed by the authority because we see it as our own self-interest. I'll give you an example of this. Take the example of this session right here. This session is proceeding in a very orderly fashion. For some reason, you are listening to me. You are paying attention, I hope. At the appropriate time, you will ask questions, you will engage with the discussion. I could direct certain things in this session. I could ask you a question and perhaps you will answer. I could stop the session. I could interject with examples and illustrations. And all of that exists without any written rules at all. So that one of the things that I like the Constitution for is that it actually explains through this principle of legitimacy how societies work, including how this session is working. This session is going on in a completely orderly fashion because you voluntarily, without probably even consciously recognizing it, you are accepting my voluntary authority to lead the session and to make a presentation to you independent of any writing, independent of any indoctrination, independent of any power or force. So that in this session, we are creating a pseudo government. You have an authority in this session, you have norms of behavior, you have the session going on in an orderly, peaceful, cooperative, mutually beneficial way without any structure whatsoever. And that's what social contract theory talks about. So that the right, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry for intervening. I have a question.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Very sorry. On this concept of social contract theory, I'm a bit familiar with a lot of these theories from years of doing jurisprudence, but connecting it to the current situation on the ground. Many have argued that the entire process of where we are with this constitutional reform is a bit, it lacks a sense of legitimacy because it did not stem from a popular referendum. So it's the government taking whatever power may have been given through the Representation of the People's Act and the Constitution, and changing that, or attempting to change those social norms and constructs. Could you comment on that aspect of people giving power to the government, and then the government taking that power and attempting to change those social norms without going back to the people first?
Well, one of the things that I will say about that is it comes back to the argument here that where does government derive its power? Conceptually, the government derives its power from this notion of social contract, the will of the people. And that is something that's demonstrated in all constitutional documents, that the will of the people shall direct the actions of government. So that one of the things, though, that I always say in terms of the relationship between government and the people is that there's a balance. There's a balance between individual rights, the idea of legitimacy and the public will, and the idea of the government exercising its mandate. My thinking is that the government always has to go back to the mandate. And even though the government is the entity that has the rulership of the society, the government has to always ensure that it is comporting itself in accordance with the will of the people. So there's a reason why we have a referendum act. We tend to use that very rarely as a society. In other countries, they have a regular use of their referenda, so that every ballot day, for example, in certain states of the United States, if there are things like the legalization of marijuana, or the imposition of certain taxes, or the reforms that you would want to put on the Constitution, what they do is that they put that to the people in a vote. And at the same time, when you would vote for your senator or your congressperson, you would also vote and you would give your opinion as to whether you believe that marijuana should be legalized, whether or not you believe that there should be a new tax, whether or not you believe that there should be a particular constitutional reform motion. So that is something that's a normative thing, meaning that that's a practice or a convention that certain societies follow. That if there is a drastic change, something that will reorient the constitutional framework, we want to amend our constitution, we have to take that back to the people. We have to ask the people what their opinion is. And it would be my view that if you want to amend the constitution, there's a reason why in law you can't amend the constitution in a period less than 90 days. You have to go through a period of public consultations. And that public consultation is not something that you do as a matter of routine. It's something that is supposed to be meaningful, because you're dealing with the most powerful document in society. You want people to take ownership, and you want people to be internalized and actively engaged in the process. Ideally, you would want that process to be people-led. So that in other countries, how legislation emerges is that legislation actually emerges from the people. Changes to the constitution emerge from the people. In my experience in Belizean societies, that we tend not to have that political culture. And this is not a fault of the government. It's a fault really of the people. We tend not to have the experience in our political culture that there is a more active and engaged citizenry, that people will demand to be involved in the process, and people will demand to lead the process. So one of the things that I have said is that politicians do what people vote for. If we do not have a very engaged democratic system, and if we don't have a system where politicians routinely go back to the people for their input in key pieces of legislation, I don't blame the politician, I blame the people. Because the Constitution is not a document for the politician. The Constitution is a document for the people. This idea of social contract theory, the people give their consent to be ruled. And if the people have government that carries out in a way that is undemocratic, it's not the government's fault, it's the people's fault. The people give their consent to be ruled. And in certain cases, they could take back their consent. And if the people do not act in ways that promote healthy discussion or demand healthy discussion, then that is a fault of the people. Is that clear,
We have a
Bryce?
question here.
Yeah, that was clear. That was clear. Go ahead, Lucian.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
In the comments from Mr. DeShiel, it says such a convention of adding questions to the ballot might be practiced here too. Is there provision for this already? If not, is this something that might be enshrined in the Constitution via the reform process?
So that's a good question, and I would say yes. So that to answer your question, the only way that we have input from the people is through the Referendum Act. And the Referendum Act, I believe, is a very solid and very strong piece of legislation. The problem with the Referendum Act is that it's rarely used. I know that we are doing the referendum exercise with the legalization of marijuana. I know that government has indicated, because of concerns that have been raised by the churches and then also banks and the financial institutions, that they may pull back the legislation. I know that we have had a referendum in terms of the legalization of offshore drilling. I know that we have had a referendum in the going to the ICJ. So that these are three examples that we have used that piece of legislation. But I think that we can use it more. And that is a way where we have an existing law. We don't need any new law. That is something just that we need to practice it more. And I was very impressed by the social partner senators led by the churches, the business, the union, and the NGO communities who led the referendum for the marijuana bill. And that's something that we could do on a regular basis. If we want to bring back the death penalty, if we want to make changes to our constitution, we could use the Referendum Act more, and it could develop into a convention or practice that any piece of legislation that is substantial, any piece of legislation, for example, the Human Rights Bill or the Equal Opportunities Bill, that's something that I would think could go to a referendum. And people could give their input in relation to that in a more substantial way. Those are pieces of legislation that we could utilize this more. We could also, as a proposal in the reform process, recommend that certain things could go on the ballot in addition to candidates. So you could actually suggest that as part of your reform mechanism, that you would want certain questions or decisions to go on the ballot along with the vote. And those are two things that could be very, very useful, I think, in a more democratic process. One of the problems that I have is that both the people and politicians feel that your involvement in the political process is only at election time, that you only show your political pleasure or displeasure every 5 years when there's general election, or every 3 years when there's municipal election. That is not the case. It is intended that government should regularly come back to the people in these ways that exist in our law, through the Referendum Act and possibly through putting certain motions on the ballot, and also consulting. For example, when any piece of legislation is being passed, that piece of legislation has to go to committee, and there is a public hearing where any member of the public can give their representations on that bill. I have rarely seen that being used meaningfully. But that's a mechanism that exists right now where people could give their input on the passage of legislation, and they could say whether or not they like it or not, or whether or not they agree or not. In my experience, I've rarely seen a bill that has been put forward by the government be amended. In other countries, bills are regularly amended. And this is an example where, without any change in our law, the citizens could be more meaningfully engaged in the legislative process. They could attend subcommittee hearings, which are public. They could propose legislation to bills. They could demand that certain bills go to the referendum. And none of these things require any changes to our existing law. All of these things require that we have a more active, involved, engaged citizenry, including that we have more forums like this, where people discuss what their powers are and they hold government to account.
I think you
questions?
made a very sobering point about the people's interaction when it comes to the political process here in Belize. When on Monday, when we sent our representatives to make our representation on the the People's Constitution Commission, our representatives were texting us, telling us that a whole lot of chaos happened because they only had allotted 15 minutes for that proceeding to happen, because they did not expect anyone to show up. They did not expect anyone to show up for that particular meeting. And so then they did not prepare. And one of the things that I found very interesting during that process was that there was not a rule of engagement either. So you had people there ranting on for 2 hours on the same issue over and over and over, not making proper representations or making substantive representations on what needs to be changed or added or edited to that particular bill. And so then when it was our turn to go on, we already had everything in place. But what I'm saying is that I go back to, you know, natural law, which says that a contract needs to have considerations for both parties, but it does not need to be equitable. And I think at this point, the people need to wake up and understand what is your equitable part of the contract. And I think we have not given consideration to that we do deserve proper representation at all levels in government.
You mentioned an excellent point. And one of the things that I will say, and this is my view, it's my personal opinion, it is that because our system of government has evolved in a certain way, and I believe that this is a offshoot of our colonial history. I believe that this is an offshoot of our experience with slavery, when we were basically, as a society, ostracized from any political power, and we were told what to do. And if you even look at the Constitution of Belize, the Constitution of Belize was drafted by our forefathers, but the Constitution of Belize was a schedule onto a law of England, so that they basically drafted what our constitution would be, and they handed this to the Belizean people, so that in terms of our internalizing the force of our constitution, in terms of our not only deserving, because I look at words very importantly, we are not deserving of participatory government. We are not deserving of a seat at the table. We're not deserving of being given a chance to give input in government. It is our right. It is our entitlement. It is the duty of government to do this, because again, and this is why I open this with the conceptual framework, the idea of government at the time. And I believe that Belizeans do not by and large accept that. That's why I preach a lot of history, because people died for constitutional government. And the idea of unconstitutional government was birthed in the flames of revolution. Buildings were burnt down. And people fought years to be given these rights. One of the things that I always admire about the American system of government is that they will burn a building down. Not to say that we have to do that, but they will fiercely defend their individual rights. Even in Jamaica, when I was studying in Jamaica, if fuel prices go up, they block one road. Not that we do that. And I'm not advocating that we do that. But it's a vastly different attitude and approach to the governmental structure and the processes of government. And I think both on the part of leadership and on the part of the individual citizen, we do not understand that and we do not appreciate that. The leadership does not understand the word consultation and engagement and input. They don't understand it. And when we pass laws, when we go through the legislative process, my experience, and I've been president of the Senate, and I have been a senator for several years. I have been head of municipal government, so I have an in-depth knowledge and experience in the workings of government. And my experience has been that governments, and this is not to say any particular government, this is UDP, this is PUP, and the fault is really our system of government and our political culture. We do not give any serious thought to the input of the people. we actually view the input of the people as being something that is inconvenient. And we try to pass laws on expediency and efficiency rather than having meaningful and serious input. I'll give you two examples. The marijuana bill. That marijuana bill was actually stopped in the Senate. That means that the bill was drafted, the bill went to the National Assembly, they took it back, the bill went back again to the National Assembly, the bill went to the House of Representatives, it was read 3 times, it went to committee, it then moved on to the Senate, and on the final day when that bill should have been passed by the National Assembly, the bill was blocked by the social partner senators, and they said that we want to go to a referendum. That should never happen. Why? Because something as important as the legalization of marijuana, that should only occur from the very beginning if you have widespread consensus. You should never find out that important social partners have a disagreement, a fundamental disagreement in the passage of these pieces of legislation, which the churches, the NGO community, the Chamber of Commerce, and the unions, who are big, major players in our political structure, major social partners. You should never find out that those people have a problem with the bill on the last day that the bill is supposed to be passed into law. You should know that, because as the leader, you should be engaging with these people from the very beginning, from the time the bill is being drafted, from the time the bill is a policy in the cabinet. You should be asking people, well, what's your view about this? Not, you don't have to ask everybody, but the people who have objections to this, they are main players in our political system. To me, it is an example of our political immaturity and the infancy of our democratic process that we would have something like that happen at the last occasion. The other example that I use is the Human Rights Bill, or the Equal Opportunities Bill. And this bill, again, was presented to the government. It was tabled in the National Assembly, and the churches had major problem with this, and they had to pull the bill. Again, something like that should never, ever happen, because important pieces of legislation, like the Human Rights Bill, the Equal Opportunities Bill, and the legalization of marijuana, these are laws or policies of government that should emerge organically. And we should have a bottoms-up approach to changes, so that we should already have a framework in place to actively and meaningfully engage social partners, so that any law that's passed would already have the consent or the popular support of the people of Belize. And we would then debate ideology. My problem in Belize is that our political system does not follow an ideological point of view. So we're actually lost. This is why when you go to the House of Representatives, all the people do in the House of Representatives is insult one another. They insult one another because there is no policy debate about legislation, none whatsoever. So even in the marijuana bill, it is only the churches that indicated a policy debate. They objected to the bill because of certain value basis, because of certain objections to national security. The Chamber of Commerce had certain concerns because of the banking. Those were policy discussions that went into the debate, and those only came into the debate at the very end. That should be what the legislative process is all about. But we don't do that in Belize. And so the point that I want to make here is that the leadership in Belize, and I'm saying not any one leader, not the current government, but all leaders, including myself, because I am a member of a political party and I used to be a senator. So I accept my feelings in this, that the leadership, both political parties, do not appreciate, accept, and view engagement with the citizenry as being something that is constructive or meaningful. They do not want it, and they will never agree to it. It is for this reason that I believe that the citizens must demand this. And the idea where the churches, the unions, the business community, and the NGO community, the example of them blocking the marijuana bill should not be something that's unique to Belize. It should be something that happens every day. It should be something that social partners, and I would put the opposition in there, I would put your organization in there, that social partners would regularly and routinely discuss and debate policy with people. And this should be something that is engaged in a meaningful and substantive way on an ongoing process. I would just ask you, when do you find out that laws are being passed before the National Assembly? Usually you would find that out after the law is actually passed. If a legislative process would be meaningful, you should find that out before the law is being passed, when the law is a policy. If we are going to change, for example, we pass new law to change the structure of our courts. We have a new courts administration bill where we are making major changes with the offices of the Chief Justice, the President of the Court of Appeal. We are merging certain parts of the judiciary. We're eliminating certain offices. That's a major piece of legislation. What is your view? And this is my question, what's your organization's view about that? When were you told about that bill? What's your level of involvement and input in the passage of that piece of legislation? If I were to ask the Chamber of Commerce, the union, the social partners, the NGO community and the business community, what was their level of involvement? I would think that they would tell me that their level of involvement was only when the bill was presented in the Senate. That is inaccurate. That is insufficient. The legislative process in Belize is broken. It needs to be more meaningful and more inclusive. And there needs to be a recognition, a cultural shift, a paradigm shift on the part of leaders in this country, that inclusion and participation should not be part of the process. It is the process. It is the process by which we formulate laws that are legitimate. And so no law should pass in this country unless there is active and meaningful legislation. And at the very least, only substantive laws should be passed with involvement from people. The second point that I want to mention about this is that I believe that responsibility, my first point, is on the leadership, that there has to be a cultural shift and a paradigm shift. No change in law or existing law can sustain active involvement. Many countries in the world have the system of government that we have. Canada, Australia, India, the United Kingdom, and they have very meaningful and engaged democratic processes, including very vibrant consultative processes. We don't have that, not because of the absence of law. We don't have that because our leaders and our citizens don't want that. And the last point that I will mention on this is that the citizen needs to get up. The citizen needs to demand and require that they are being consulted, because it is your right. It is the way the system was designed, and the system will never work unless there is meaningful participation from the citizens.
Mr. Bradley, quick question along the line of citizens being inactive from the process of engagement. From the historical context that you spoke about in the presentation, many may say that while we have a democracy, the ramifications of this style of oligarchy still prevails within our system of governance, where family members succeed their predecessors, quote unquote, because of the control of the two parties and their ability to manipulate the system. What recommendation would you provide as a mechanism in the Constitution to prevent this from continuing?
Okay, so I get onto this in a little bit more of the presentation, but one of the things that I will talk about is I think you should critically review whether or not Belize should go to a Republican form of government. And one of the things I talk about in the presentation is that we have a fused system of law, which in the parliamentary system, the executive and the legislature are fused. So the executive dominates the government. The executive, the prime minister and his cabinet or her cabinet dominates the government. And this is a fundamental flaw with parliamentary systems. And so if there are not adequate checks and balances, if there are not adequate mechanisms existing in the structure to provide for appropriate limitations on government. So you could talk about things like term limits. You could talk about things like direct voting of the people. You could talk about things like the direct election of our prime minister. You could talk about things like ensuring that the independent commissions, the electoral and Boundaries Commission, the Integrity Commission, the Public Services Commission, that these things are controlled by independent parties or by the social partners, so that you could talk about making sure that those bodies are independent and autonomous, independent of government involvement, because right now we don't have that. So that one of the things that I think that you should do is that you should take a comprehensive assessment and to look at whether or not another form of government, including a Republican or presidential form of government, would be more effective. I don't necessarily support that, but I do support the looking at that and the analysis of that approach of government. And I do support including more checks and balances in our government, like term limits, like the reform of campaign finance, like the requirement for political parties to be registered and regulated in Belize, like establishing independent financial commissions, including the Integrity Commission. For example, we have an Integrity Commission, but the law is very limited. You need to improve that piece of legislation, because what the government does is that they just don't fund the Integrity Commission. So there's no auditor there, there's no accountant there, there's no lawyer there. So even if they wanted to investigate a politician for fraud, there's no money for that. So that if you wanted really to look at it, there are very practical ways that we could recommend to make serious changes, quick changes to our political structure, to make it more accountable, to make it more transparent, and to make it realize the full principle of our democratic vision that is stated in our Constitution.
Thanks for that, Mr. Bradley, because we always are very interested in reform proposals. But before I continue, I realized Mr. DeShiel, Christopher had a question. Chris, please go ahead, open the mic, and please feel free.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Bradley, and thank you for the opportunity. I just had a question about listening to what you just said about the a few points you mentioned about our Constitution having been developed, you mentioned briefly, as a schedule of a British parliamentary document. And then I like what you said about the bottom-up framework or philosophy that you don't see currently in place, right? But at the start of the talk, I wonder if you just comment on what you said about the Constitution. You said the Constitution you felt was very solid, a solid document.
Yes.
A good document because it was one of later constitutions to be developed, and we had these like regional antecedents to use. But I've been hearing recently, educating myself on related issues, that the Constitution was developed and adopted rather quickly, I've heard said, a matter of weeks. And because of disagreements over the move to independence, both parties not participating equally in the process, something like that. And further, because there's borrowing from elsewhere involved, it's somehow not organic and not indigenous enough to Belize. I wonder how you would respond to that kind of alternative take. Is that detract from the current document? It doesn't change your opinion on how solid our current Constitution is?
No, I think the fundamental point that you capture is to what extent the Constitution reflects us. That's the point. And so one of the things that I think is that I could pull the Constitution from a textbook from the United States. I could write it on a piece of paper. It could fall out of the sky. The Constitution is a perfect document. I love the Belizean Constitution. When I read the Belizean Constitution, sometimes it brings me to tears, the way how it is so perfectly written, the preamble to the Belize Constitution, the expression of our rights that talks about who I am. But one of the problems that I see is to the extent, and not necessarily that anything that you have said is a problem, the fact that the Constitution was drafted very quickly, the fact that the Constitution did not necessarily have buy-in from both political parties at that time existing or from all political angles. I actually think that all of those things are not important. And all of those things are irrelevant. We are existing today. We are living on the 30th of July, 2022. We are about 40 some years after our independence. Whatever has happened before has happened, and let that be as it is. Put that to rest. The current question is, to what extent does the existing constitution, to what extent does our constitution express our ethos as a people? To what extent do we internalize the constitution? To what extent do we as Belizean citizens give it a voice, give it meaning, give it teeth, enforce it, and make it the law in Belize? So that my issue is not necessarily with how the constitution came about. My issue is, how do we as Belizeans interpret, internalize, and give effect to the constitution today? One of the things that I am always very impressed with is the Muslim religion. One of the things that I was told is that each student of Islam have to memorize word for word the Quran. And there is a ceremony when each male student of the Quran, I believe it's at the age of 5 years old, they have to recite the Quran word for word before their community. And I have always been impressed with that. And I could say, could I really memorize and then recite the Bible? I'm 43 years old. I don't know that I could do that today. I don't know that I could recite one chapter of the Bible. I don't know that I could recite the Belize Constitution. But what that shows me in the Islamic faith is that the Quran to them is not a document. It's not something that's written down. The Quran lives in their heart. The Quran is something that is etched in their minds. This Quran is something that is the ethos of their religious faith and their fervor, that they believe in it, that it is their creed and their governing philosophy and document. And so one of the things that I would think is that if you take 1,000 Belizeans, and it's not really accurate to ask for an example with just one or two, but if you take 1,000 Belizeans and you ask 1,000 Belizeans to name 5 fundamental rights that we have in Belize, I would doubt that 500 of them could name 5 fundamental rights. If you ask them to say certain sections of the Constitution, I doubt that 500 of them could actually say that. So that the point that I want to make is that we as a society need to make sure that our Constitution, even if it's one word, even if it's only a page, that our Constitution is the document that we live by, because we break it every single day. And so I am not necessarily concerned with how the Constitution emerged. I'm not necessarily concerned with what processes existed at that time. I'm concerned with what we deal with our reality now, and how do we move forward as a people, that we are able to use this constitutional reform process as a meaningful process to ensure that the people of Belize internalize our constitution and we give effect to it now, we buy into it now. You will always have divisions. You will always have the fact that people may not agree with the step going forward. One of the problems why our constitution was developed in the way that it was because at the time, the political parties couldn't agree with the defense guarantee. That's not important. That's not important. What is important is that we do have a constitution, and that our constitution reflects our will, and that we as Belizeans have a consensus about the Constitution, that we understand what it says and that we fight for it in our daily lives.
Great input, Mr. Bradley. We appreciate let me read the comment from Christopher. We speak in spiritual terms, a visceral, emotional reaction to reading the Constitution. Thanks for the response. Because, you know, it's like you said, it's more than a document. It's something that speaks to our spirit or character as a nation. So certainly it should emote that type of feeling and importance to us as individual people and as a collective. But please continue with the presentation, and of course we'll continue to dive in
Yeah,
when
one of the
you
things.
these back reactions.
Thanks, and I welcome the input and the stuff. One of the things that I will say, because I mean, I've traveled to the United States on a regular basis. I have two brothers that live in the United States. Many of you might have relatives that live in the United States. I studied for 4 years in the United States, so I have a lot of experience from their system of government. And I oftentimes watch the American news. And one of the things that I will say of the United States government that I like is that they take their politics seriously. And there's a thing right now that Americans are, at least the Congress in the United States, they want gun reform. And the vast majority of Americans want protection for the right to bear arms. That's in their constitution. And an American citizen will die for that. So that people think, okay, well, why do you want to have a gun? My brother, for example, lives outside of Houston. And when I went to his house one time, I remember the first time when he moved, he had this big, like an elephant gun that he said, I said, why do you need that? He's never shot an elephant. But there was this big gun that's the size of a couch that he actually lift up out of his couch. He kept it in a part of his house. And it's something that is, but they have a certain reverence because that's their right. And in the United States, even though there are some political corners that may want to limit gun rights, or they may want to take away people's guns, they will never do that in the United States because the individual citizen views that as their constitutional right, and they will never ever give up that right. They will fight for that right to the very end. But one of the reasons why they have such a right for individual guns is not because they want to protect themselves from a burglar. The right to bear arms actually stems from an attitude of the American citizen to fight the tyranny of government. They want, and if you read a Republican, and this is not my view, but if you read a Republican's attitude or approach to the right to bear arms, the reason why they tell you that is because they tell you that we want a militia. We want to be able to have our weapons when government comes to our door to take away our rights. We want to be able to fight against the government. And one of the things, I mean, I'm not in support of this, and I think that it was wrong, but one of the reasons why the United States had the insurrection on January 6th, why they stormed the government, is because individuals actually believe that the government is the enemy. That comes from a certain value basis where the American experience in democracy is framed on the notion of limited government, controlled government, government that only exists in a particular frame and only is limited to doing certain things, government that doesn't tax us, government that doesn't impose regulation, government that is very controlled and sober. And I think in Belize, we don't have those discussions. So that in Belize, we don't really have a discussion as to what is government? What is the extent to which government should exercise political power? And what is the relationship between government and the citizen? The American citizen thinks about that every day. And when they want to pass laws, when they want to tax the citizen, when they want to take away their guns, they will go on TV, they will go to Congress, they will write their congressperson, they will go and they will rally and they will protest. The other day, about a month ago, I went to Washington, D.C., and I saw no fewer than 15 different protests around Capitol Hill. At the time, they were protesting the new case, the Dobbs case that overturned Roe versus Wade. They protest the American government every day. There's a famous protester there that has been there continuously since 1967, and they're protesting the Vietnam War. And that is a continuous protest that from 1967, that has been on the grounds of the Capitol building. And they change it, different people have gone there, but that protest has been there continuously from 1967. Imagine that. Imagine if Belizean citizens, and I know that a lot of Belizeans have this, but imagine if the average Belizean citizen had that level of fervor, that they understood what their role is as a citizen, and they challenge on a daily basis, meaning that they saw it as their duty. They saw it as their obligation. They saw it as their sworn command as a citizen to challenge the government on a regular basis. When I was mayor, I regularly challenged the prime minister. I can tell you openly that he didn't like me. And we were from the same political party, because when I went into government, it's not my responsibility to agree with you. My responsibility is to give my opinion and to challenge decision-making and to take it to the people so that we can have a better form of government. Why is it that we have to agree? Politics is not about agreement. Politics is about policy, and politics is about argument and division and raising ideas peacefully, and the legislative process that looks at protests and that develops legislation organically back and forth. And I just don't see that as being the culture that we have in Belize. And unless we have that culture, unless we develop it, we would be at a loss. We could reform the system and we could choose any political system that we want. I could download a document right now and I could tell you 50 different reform proposals that we have. But unless we change our heart and our spirit and our mind as it comes to the Constitution, unless we change our attitude about leadership and how we engage with government, we will never have change in this society. So what we really need is that we need leaders like you, people who are on this call, people who can internalize a different understanding of government and who can go into government, run for political office and champion reform. Because what we have had there is leaders who have been indoctrinated in the same old culture of authoritarianism and absolute government, and they go in there, and when they become a minister or an area representative or prime minister, they think their word is law, and they just go in there and they just run the government without any input. And we will continue to have that unless we change our mindset, unless there's a paradigm shift about the political process, both from the leadership and the citizenry level, and that we are able to internalize the Constitution and we're able to see ourselves as defenders of the Constitution, and we make this a reality in our society.
Mr. Bradley, you spoke about a lot of internalization, and one of the things that I see missing from our culture is that we don't teach on Constitution. And what I mean, like you said, if you ask 500 persons to name 5 rights bestowed upon us by the Constitution, they won't be able to answer. In comparison to American education, where they have to learn their pledge to the United States flag, they have to learn how to recite their Constitution, and like what you said, it becomes a living document in their hearts. And I think we, apart from leadership and the political system, I think the cultural shift needs to happen, that we need to start advocating that more teaching happen on this, because at the end of the day, our government is formed in Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And that is something that requires a big discussion, because of what you explained historically is that the monarchs believe in absolute power. And then we find now that in Belize that we find that they left behind, and for cultural context, there was a nickname for certain Black persons that were left behind to lead, and they were they were known as the Black Creoles.
Or the Royal Creole, like I always say that. I always say that.
Creoles, and they're still left in power up to this day. We find in the 2020 elections, 2 prominent politicians retired, and we got a 2-4. So we found that 2 of their relatives ended up in the House of Representatives.
You could say they saw. You could say they saw. No shame, man.
No, I'm trying to be very you know, everybody knows, right? But at the end of the day, what I'm saying is that this culture of absolute power comes from monarchism, and that at the end of the day, while you said that our Constitution is perfect, there are certain things in our Constitution that I don't necessarily agree with, because at the end of the day, if we are an independent nation, then why do we have a head of state who is a monarch who resides in Great Britain. And I have a big problem with that, because at the end of the day, it carries on these things. And then I think back upon way back in ancient history, when we had the Greeks and when they formed the Senate and when they cast lots and these things, that was really the genesis of the Republican system, that these people had to go to battle to ensure that the people had a say in their government. And I think, like what you said, we can get this done peaceably, but at the end of the day, we have to understand the historical context, which I am completely appreciative of, that you went all the way there, explained the Renaissance and all of that, and the industrial area and everything, because at the end of the day, when they overthrew the government, like the Romanovs and the Kaisers and all of that, in 1940, 1950, 1917, that era there, you found that the British royal family had to do so much to kind of coagulate their way in to ensure that they even changed their German last name to a more English sounding last name to ensure that they retain power. And so then you find that even in Belize, that we have a constitutional monarch that isn't a Belizean national. And how does that affect our way of life? That's just my point of view.
One of the things that I do agree with you on is, and this would be my opinion, it's just my opinion, I think that all we did is that we took the colonial government from the United Kingdom, headed by the Queen, and very administrative, so that English government is very administrative. There's a monarch, and there's still a great respect for the Queen, and they're very obedient, and they're very law-abiding. They're very democratic because they have conventions over from the Magna Carta, 1213, or very, very early on. So they have a strong tradition of democratic principles and respecting the rule of law and so forth. But what we did is that we just took that system of government that's very top-heavy, that's very, very autocratic, that was the colonial government that existed in Belize, and we just grafted that into Belize after independence without any change and without any real internalization of ourselves. And so you rightly point out, and I do agree with it, that what we had is that the same bureaucrats that ruled Belize before independence, the Royal Creole, were the same bureaucrats now who were in control after independence. And the same way that they were dictated to from England, where the governor would have had direct powers, was the same way that they started to rule the independent country of Belize, an offshoot of colonialism, so that we did not really feel a sense of independence. One of the reasons why I mentioned revolution is because revolution connotes certain things, a new beginning, a revolutionary way of thinking, an awakening of ourselves. That when we say that we are a constitutional democracy, there is a newness. One of the things that I would ask you to do is read the Declaration of the US Independence. Beautiful document, but it expresses the attitude and the approach of the people to government at that time. What we did when we became independent, it was a very nonchalant thing. We had the colonial government on September 30th, 1981, and then we had the independent government, September 21st, 1981. So that we just transitioned from a colonial government to just the same colonial approach and idea to government. Nothing very inclusive, nothing particularly revolutionary. It was just a routine thing. And we need to go through, one of the things that I asked my class is, do you think Belize would be a different society if we had a revolution? And there are various rules or attitudes or inputs that my students give, and I believe it would be different. I believe that we have the same colonial slave mentality in how we lead. And just as how the colonial government expected the colonial citizen to listen to the government, it's just the same way that the new governments, both political parties, have inherited that tradition of leadership, that leadership is very centralized and that leadership should be listened to. And there's no revolutionary way, there's no involvement or no input. We actually think that that's an inconvenience. It's an inconvenience when people, man, I want to pass the law, why you have to give me your input? I mean, I don't draft it. I don't pay one consultant from the United States or from England to draft the law. It's a good law. Why do you have to give your input? So we in the leadership view it as an inconvenience that you would actually have an opinion. Why do you want to have an opinion? The law is not about you, just follow the law. That's our approach to government. The last point that I really want to mention is, I think that you mentioned something that is very, very fundamental. And if you notice, many of the things that we have spoken about today have nothing to do with reform. It has nothing to do with changing the law. It has very much to do with changing ourselves. And I believe two things that I live with is, one, the education system, as you said. I believe that our education system is not conducive to independent thought. I have done presentations, I have participated as a student, and I have been a teacher in American classes, not formal classes, but where I've had to give presentations and lectures and so forth. And if I ask a question in an American classroom, we're talking about maybe 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds. I can guarantee you everybody will raise their hand to answer, or at least 80% will raise their hand to answer. If I ask that same question to a group of Belizean students in a Belizean classroom about the same exact topic, the percentage would be reversed. And only 20% of the participants, if that much, would raise their hand to give a response. So the point that I'm mentioning here, and this is not to knock or insult our Belizean people. I am a Belizean. But this is to say that a lot of this has to do with our thinking. I learned leadership from a young age. I became a leader in Belize because I used to participate in student government. I was president of my high school. There was a culture in my high school to encourage students to be active. And so I took advantage of that. And that translated into my adult life, that I was an active citizen. I wanted to be a politician. What I find is that if we use our schools, our primary schools, our high schools, our universities as laboratories to challenge our students, to teach them civics, to teach them citizenry, and to participate in their government and to be good, engaged leaders, then the empowered student will be an empowered citizen. What I tend to find, and I've seen this from both political parties, when you have a young leader who shows promise, both political parties, the PUP and the UDP, try put their teeth into that person, and they try to indoctrinate that person into their own party political ways, and they give them that whole way that we look at politics, which is very parochial and very unhelpful, which is not a good view of leadership. So that I think our education system has to become revolutionary. And then the last point that I mentioned on this is that I do think that you did mention a good point, that we perhaps should consider whether or not we should move to a Republican system or we should do away with the Queen, because at least ceremonially, it would show that we are a republic, that we are independent, because really and truly, I don't know from our independence that we really have vestiges of independence. What can you say of Belize that really shows that we are an autonomous, independent country? I actually think that we're not. Politically speaking, we're very immature in our democratic processes. We're not a very, we don't have a long tradition of democratic ideals. Economically, we're very dependent. And socially and culturally, we're very dependent. If you look at Belizean culture, we're heavily influenced by the United States. We're heavily influenced by other trends, including Central America. So that what really can you say about our practical independence? And I think perhaps maybe at least having a discussion as to doing away with the Queen, like what Barbados recently did, and like what Jamaica has indicated that they will do. I think that that conversation will go a long way for us to internalize what it means to truly be an independent country.
Just one more thing, sorry, Barris, to your response to your thing is, you speak about political parties and their philosophies. And when we look at both major political parties, we don't see a big philosophical change, again, in comparison to other jurisdictions, most notably the US. When you find that how some of these political parties have started, we don't have much of a philosophical difference in terms of, see, in the US, we have people who are liberals and conservatives. And last week we were throwing around the term conservative a lot. But I think as a nation, we don't have that difference in terms of how do we speak as a political party? How do political parties speak? What do they bring different that is philosophically? And you spoke earlier about them not having the propensity to have discussions around policy. And so at the end of the day too, our political parties operate the same way. And you alluded to that earlier, because like if Brighton or Dominique or, or any other else person begin to raise up in leadership, you find that one political party is going to try to sway them and then indoctrinate them to have that same type of way of ruling so that that can continue on, which gives these political parties relevance. And I think, yes, you're right that we have to look at a lot at the way of how we consider the way, how we view the Constitution. And yes, the curriculum is being reformed right now, but around what premise is it being reformed? You talked about being included in the political process. I mean, we read communiques for this, we read communiques for being involved in the People's Constitution Commission. And at the end of the day, these communiques were not even distributed properly, things like that. And people have nothing to say about it. And I think it's time that we start to demand peaceably that we need to be involved in these type of processes, because that's the only way we can move forward. And that's my final thought.
Okay. No, don't let it be your final thoughts. But one of the things that I will say, and I will say this, because I agree with you very much, and I agree with you 100%, and I'll put this out there. I think that our political system, and I'll use this word, and I'll be deliberately provocative in this presentation. I think that our political system is lost. Why? Because we do not have an ideological and policy divide in our political parties and in our political system. And that's a fundamental flaw in our system. So that, for example, I could ask any one of you, why do you vote? And what difference is there between the political parties in Belize, the UDP and the PUP? I remember at one point, I went to a presentation that Niche had at the Bliss Institute, where they invited all the former prime ministers to just give their input on Belize. And the Honorable George Price was not there. At the time, he was still alive, but he was very ill. So you had at the time, the Right Honorable Manuel Esquivel, who was still alive, the Right Honorable Said Musa, who appeared, and the Right Honorable Dean Barrow, who was there. 3 former prime ministers, and they gave their input. And I was actually surprised that ideologically speaking, the Right Honorable Dean Barrow and the Right Honorable Said Musa were both aligned. They agreed exactly together with their ideology. And the Right Honorable Manuel Esquivel was more a conservative, and he followed more of a Republican style of limited government, very management oriented, very kind of like efficient in terms of taxes and so forth. So it wasn't clear in terms of an ideological divide, but both the Right Honorable Dean Barrow and the Right Honorable Said Musa spoke about pro-poor policies, a more socialist or more liberal political agenda, where the Honorable Manuel Esquivel talked about a different kind of thing. But these were not things which were indoctrinated in the party. They just spoke about it because it was their individual belief. And the point that I'm making, which you have made, is that we do not have ideological discussions in Belize. We do not have policy discussions in Belize. So that when you go to the National Assembly, they don't talk about anything. There is nothing of substance that goes on in there. And I'm not saying this to criticize them. I was in the National Assembly. And so if it's a criticism, it's a criticism to me. But I'm saying because we do not have ideological discussions, because we do not have, if not ideological discussions, policy discussions. What is the role of government? What is the role of church and religion? What type of legal system do we want? What type of court system do we want? What type of rights do we want in terms of our individual citizens? What is the relationship between government and the citizen? What type of reforms do we want? UNCAC. We don't have any type of meaningful discussion about this. You listen to the National Assembly and it will be a presentation so that they will present a bill. And oftentimes they will talk about an hour presenting the bill. And then when there's debate, oh, you do this under your term, or you thief, or when you know this, or you you parcel drugs, or you get arrested at the United States, or you know crackhead, or it's actually nothing in terms of a political ideological debate. This is not to say that in other countries they don't have quarrels. The United States is very quarrelsome. England is very quarrelsome. I've listened to their parliaments, I've seen their parliaments, and they have the same kind of problems that we have. But I'm saying that we have a fundamental flaw because underpinning our discussions, there is a lack of ideological discussion and there's a lack of policy debate. So really, if there's the marijuana bill, I was surprised that both UDP and PUP agreed with the bill, but the bill is still not passed. So what's the disagreement and who disagrees with the bill? So there is not really an ideological discussion or a policy discussion. The churches were the ones who brought the policy discussion into fray and formulated it in a way that it should have been discussed from the very beginning. So that I think what you are saying is fundamental, and this goes back to part of my presentation. We need to have an understanding in this country as leaders, as civic leaders, each of you, what is the role of government? In the United States, and one of the slides that I have going forward, it talks about this division between the Democrats and the Republicans. And you can see a difference, ideologically speaking, that there is a view for big government, higher taxes, a welfare system, pro-abortion rights, pro-social welfare, pro-government supported healthcare, pro-social security, pro-protection of the environment, pro-climate change. And then you have a Republican conservative view, which is anti-abortion, pro-small government, anti-regulation, less taxes, no social welfare, and a promoting of individual economic rights. So when you look at that, an individual could explain to you clearly why they vote. Why will I vote for Joe Biden versus Donald Trump? Why will I vote for my member of Congress or my senator that is a Democrat versus a Republican? There's a clear party platform. There's a clear ideological view there. In Belize, we don't have that. And so our political discussions cannot be mature, or it cannot be beneficial or productive because we're not talking about anything. What really, in terms of the direction of the country, are we talking? All our government does, and this is a flaw, all our government does, both governments, is they just manage the country. They don't lead, they manage the country. They try to ensure that the country doesn't go bankrupt, and they try to make sure that we pay all our external bills, but there's no leadership in the country. And when I mean leadership, I mean there's no vision from an ideological standpoint. It is not that any leader says that this is my ideological or my policy vision for Belize, and this is what I want to take the country, and then you discuss it and you vote on it. People don't do that. So when you look at Belize, we generally vote because of history. So that a lot of our political history has been along ethnic divisions. It has been along the Guatemalan claim, so that it has been along this question of the independence of Belize, so that if you looked at our history, the People's United Party really championed independence. The United Democratic Party at the time opposed independence. The People's United Party championed Belizean rights and fighting against the Guatemalan claim. The United Democratic Party wanted a defense guarantee from the United Kingdom, and so that stalled independence. And that really shaped the independence movement in Belize. At one point, Philip Goldson and George Price were in the same political party, and they divided, they divided over the Guatemalan claim. And so the Guatemalan claim has been a major political divisive point in our history, which has really shaped the political parties in Belize. You have also had ethnic reasons, so that, for example, I tend to think that our political parties are shaped around ethnicities, the Creoles, the Mestizos, and so forth. I don't really want to get into too much detail because I don't want the presentation to become divisive, but when you look at our political history, you can see ethnic divisions in it. For example, it was mentioned before, this notion of the Royal Creole, that came from a certain philosophy of our ethnic history. You can see where there was a shift from Belize being Belize city dominated to being out district dominated. The influence of immigrants from Central America and the real population change of Belize, and how that has impacted our population centers, our political centers, and our party political makeup. So that our politics has not really been shaped around, which it needs to be to a certain extent, ideological and policy divisions. It's been shaped around the Guatemalan claim, around ethnicity, around religion, around economic power, and then around families. So that a lot of people have told me that when I run for government, boy, Darrell, I can't vote for you because I related to this one. Or when you look at the political parties in Belize, they have been very dynastic. And you could change this, and this is with both political parties. You can see that many of the people currently in the House of Representatives are related to one another. If not sons, they are cousins, they are distant relatives, or they come from the same kind of community. It's a very elitist or a very fraternal type of structure where it's passed down from family to family and from a particular group to a particular group. Again, this is not unnatural. This exists in other countries. It's particularly exacerbated in Belize because we have a small society, so we know a lot of people. But if you look at our political system and why people vote, people do not vote for ideologies or policies. The lateral point that I want to make towards this is the impact of money on politics. That one of the reasons why people oftentimes give their vote to a political party is because of vote buying. And this is a significant problem in Belize, for which we need to regularize and reform the electoral system. So we don't necessarily need to reform the constitution, but we need to reform the electoral system to make it more difficult for there to be vote buying, and to reform campaign finance. Both political parties collect a significant amount of money from private sector and the business community. That needs to be regulated. That needs to be transparent. That needs to be known by members of the public, and that needs to be limited because that is a big influence on our politics. So I do agree with the point that we need to move towards more of an ideological division. And I don't know that we can do anything to prevent family members to run for elected office. One of the things that I will propose is term limits. I think that when you look at the National Assembly, about half the people have been in there for more than 25 years. That's too much. People are in the National Assembly and they think it's their lifelong gift to be in the National Assembly. If you have a 2-term limit, what that will do is that will involve more inclusivity, that will encourage more women and young people to get involved into politics. Because if you have a person who is in an office for 35 years, that means for 35 years, another person can't vote for that office or run for that office. If you have term limits for 10 years, then that does is that creates a culture of activism, because more people have to run for elected office. And then that recycles the elected officials so that there's more people involved in the political process.
Couple comments before you continue, Mr. Bradley. Brighton asked, could it be too that we do not have a lot of competent leaders because our system is based on popularism and not merit? The second one is, I believe this is one of our fundamental issues, talking about ideologies. Ms. Dawson said, relevant discussion focusing on the issues and agree to disagree professionally. And then Brighton said, you're speaking my language, Mr. Bradley. We not have vision. Ms. Rikenya said, this is an individualist vision, in my opinion, a vision to allow specific families to remain in the political arena. Thank you for the presentation and pointing out the need for educational campaigns on our Constitution. And finally, education can break the cycle, from Ms. Dawson again. Those are the comments.
Okay, excellent comments. One of the things that I stood out to me is that this notion, because I oftentimes see it and I agree with you, but I want kind of like joke back, because I have been a leader in Belize and I've been a politician. I am a politician. So that the point that I will make is this notion of competency in leadership. So I'll throw this back to you. If we have incompetent leaders, whose fault is that? Who puts them there? So if we have incompetent leaders, that comes back to the vote, because I wouldn't vote for the people there. So like, to my mind, it's not a leadership problem. It's an us problem, and it's a systemic problem. And the problem, it's not something that we're going to solve in one afternoon sit down, and it's good to have discussions about this. I think some fundamental takeaways from this is that it has to do with our education system and our understanding on a whole of leaders. One of the things that I will say is that I have been very impressed with you this evening and the level of your comment, your engagement, and I think you would be good leaders in the country. And I look forward to voting for you in the government sometime in the future. But this notion of the fact that it is about one political party or the competency level of leaders, I think that it always goes back to the people and the level at which the people are involved, the level at which there's adequate education, the level at which we have a culture of civic activism, the level at which people internalize their role and the role of the Constitution and what their power is, and the level at which people can engage and hold their government on account. I never blame the leadership and I never blame the politician. One of the things that I will say here too, and I use it as an example, I have never been arrested. Darrell Bradley, I have never been arrested. I use this as an example one time. One time I was at my office and I was busy and my law office is on Regent Street. And I walked from Regent Street to the court, which is about a 10-minute walk, about a half a mile. I walked from there to the court without a mask. Right across from my office, there's a GSU subdivision. There's a police station right across from my office. And the police are always out there. The courts, the Magistrates Court and the Supreme Court are replete with police officers. And I walked past several police officers that morning, and I walked from my office into court, and nobody stopped me and told me I didn't have a mask. I went into court, and the marshal of the court said, "But Mr. Bradley, you not got on your mask, you can't come to court." And I ran back to my office to get a mask, and I ran back to court. Nobody arrested me. Why? And the reason that I would say is that there is imbalances in society. And this is not to say that our society is imperfect, but it is to say that We have empowered people in our society, and those are the people who get protected. But that can happen to everybody if people are assertive about their rights. And I think by and large, people are not assertive, and people need to be assertive. And we need to have a legislative process that is empowering of people, and the change will never, ever, 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 ever come from the politician. Why is it right now that you think UNCAC is not going anywhere? I drafted a law, campaign finance reform. It took me 2 weeks to draft the law. I downloaded a model legislation from the United Nations. So UNCAC, they actually give you the law that you may want to draft. All you have to do is modify it to your local thing. We have signed on to UNCAC for more than a year, and not one meaningful piece of legislation has been passed. That will never pass. Why? Because politicians don't want to change, and the citizens are not insisting that they change. Change will not happen unless the citizen demands that change happens. And I think it all comes back to the idea of the citizen, our ability to organize and mobilize, our ability to campaign on ideologies, and our ability to hold leaders to account for what they're saying.
On a point of reflecting on the reality of the situation at hand, Mr. Bradley, as it pertains to the competency of leaders and the people's decision to put them into power. One of the things I think is our reality is that we do not get to choose who we vote for. That's presented to us by the major political parties, and we're not the system of governance where we vote for a president, where everybody could vote and put that person into power. The situation is not like that. We have standard bearers, and we vote for those who are in our constituencies. I say this because you are of the perspective that it comes back to the people. How then do we put into the Constitution that the people get more involved in the selection process of those who are going to end up being our leaders?
So I would say this, and I'm just being provocative deliberately so, and I respect and appreciate your point. But I would look at countries like Central America, look at El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras. One of the former presidents of these Central American countries was recently indicted on drug trafficking charges in the United States. Guatemala. So these countries, which are Republican countries, they have presidents. They have a fully separate system of government. They're not parliamentary systems like ours. But I would argue that our democracy is stronger than theirs. So that it's not a systemic problem. It's not a problem that you can write a law to pass, or you can make reform to pass. The law or the change, it does include some of that, because the issue of term limits and campaign finance reform and UNCAC regulations, things which we've been talking about for years, like these are, they are not where you need for me call again presentation. Both these are things that have been footed up for years, but no politician has done any of that. Why? Because they will never do it. So that we keep talking about reform, 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 as though reform will come from like a messiah that comes from heaven and falls on our lap. We are the reform. You are the reform. So that when you look at the fact that we don't vote for our leaders, I agree with that. I think that that's a problem, but it's not an insurmountable problem. The United Kingdom has that same system, and their system is one of the best democracies in the world. Canada, I recently came back from Canada yesterday. Canada has a very vibrant democracy, and they have the very same system that we have. Barbados, I am very impressed with Mia Mottley. I think that she's one of the best leaders in the world. They have the exact same system that ours, and they have a pluralistic society and very, very involved democracy and whatever. So that the problem is not the law. And I find that sometimes when we have these discussions about political reform, yes, we need to put forward reform mechanisms. And we need to have proposals. And I've put forward a little bit of a few proposals that I think: campaign finance reform, term limits. We can have more active use of the Referendum Act. We can have, you can discuss moving to a Republican system, or you can have a system where there's a direct election for prime minister, so that there you can eliminate the queen of the head of state. So even if you don't want to fully go presidential or Republican, you can have a system at least that does not have Queen Elizabeth as the head, and that's more autonomous or original as Belize. So there are lots of things that you can do. But the idea that changing the system will somehow bring change in our democratic culture is a farce. That will never happen. Change will happen when the people bring about change. And I have used this in presentations that I have done, and I've read this. It says, good men, and I'll add good men and women, good men and women make good laws, but good laws do not make good men and women. So you can have the perfect laws, you can have a very good system of government, but it's still corrupt. So you have systems of government in Belize that are parliamentary and that are presidential. And both of those systems have very good examples of very democratic societies that are pluralistic and inclusive. And you have examples of horrible situations of autocratic dictatorial rule. What we need is a confluence of a citizen understanding. And a big part of it, which I think should be a big push, is education reform and teaching activism in the classroom. I do think that bringing on board UNCAC is very revolutionary. People say, well, we're not always talk about UNCAC, but we've never done it. We've never done it, so we continue to have examples of corruption in government. We need to bring on board term limits. The minute you do term limits, immediately what that will do is that will tell a politician, my power is limited because I can't there for no 30 years. So if I want to make this one gravy train for rule this place for 30 years, that not what happen. So that when you're there for only 10 years, it allows you to think reflectively about your time being there and to use it wisely. And when you force the elected officials to move out of office, you're recycling it with better leaders, different ideas, and you're bringing in an organic, more inclusive form of government that brings in more women and more young people. So that there are things that we can do, but I think my point of view would be that we should move away from this notion that it is somehow the other person's fault, the other person's fault. I've heard a certain amount of comments this afternoon that talks about leadership, that talks about the system, that talks about the other person. We are Belize. We are the democracy. And the failings of this country is our failings. And what I do in my personal life is that I do not blame anybody else. If Belize is a failed democracy, which I don't think it is, because we have very good leaders and we have very good examples of leaders, and we have been able to make inroads. And I think by and large, we have a peaceful, constitutional law-abiding society. By and large, we need much improvement, but we do have a system that is there that's workable and functioning. And we are doing better than our neighbors, but the reform and the obligation of reform is our responsibility.
All right, before you continue, we have Alexis who had her hand up. Alexis, unmute.
Hi, sorry, I almost forgot the question.
Oh, sorry about that. I talk too much, that's a problem.
Okay, I'll do it real quick. While you're talking about the constitution, the politicians, the age, the mindset, I do think that sometimes we tend to forget, even though you spoke about culture, you tend to forget the mindset of some of the young people or some of the individuals living in Belize, because growing up, some of them were told or were taught that you're not allowed to speak, you're not allowed to question these things. And it goes along like, how do you say? You carry these things until you're an adult, and your work environment changes that, or the individuals that you meet in school changes your mindset, right? So I say this because I never followed politics. I never understood the constitution. I didn't even care to hear about ministers, CEOs, or anything of the sort until I started working in an office. that works along with the government. And then I started to look into those things. And while you're talking about the Constitution and while you're talking about the office and changing the bills, I do think that it is important to also think about the importance of religion, because it does play a role in how people view the law, as well as the politicians or the offices. Sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. Go ahead, Lucian. I'll write it down.
All right, we have some comments here as well, so let me get to them quickly. Jaliza said, the influx of immigrants within our country affects our democracy. Can you elaborate on how we can properly educate persons, immigrants, that is, who became citizens and are given voting rights when they technically do not have any understanding of our system or any loyalties to our country? Does that not make it, sorry, technical difficulty. Yes, does not make it easier to buy out culture to continue? And next one is from Miss August Azer, sorry. Politics in Belize have developed in a way that political party control the people. They have created a mass level of poverty, which allow gross level of dependency. People are so controlled. Why may think me go like that? I might young, but I kind of, you know, sometimes technologically in it.
I could read it for you, Lucian.
Please.
It says people are so controlled that they are afraid to show their face or say anything because their jobs or the job of a family member could be ruined. It's almost like politicians operate like thugs who through their own means punish the people. I now see this becoming more and more. And so it's important that this organization is formed, because this organization can lend to the change which is very needed. And then Ms. Dawson followed up and said, we need to be a people that is always questioning. We deserve better than accepting what's handed to us. Assertiveness is key.
Yes.
All right, Jalisa said we deserve better, but we, the people, must be consistent in holding our leaders accountable. Ishmael said he agrees. Ms. Baltazar said assertiveness and accountability, they are both needed for any change to be realized in our country. And Ms. Dawson said, are we up to the point where we can write and name our candidate on the ballot if the embedded choices are not favorable to us? Not sure about that one. Our citizenry needs to be stopped. Our citizenry needs to be stop being so passive and malleable. Everyone loves to talk about UNCAC and demand it, but when they're on the side of the opposition, when they are in power, the conversation changes. And then finally, we need to be that change we want to see. Those in the comments.
Okay, so there was a lot of things. One of the things that I will do is that I will say this, that when I was in government, both as a senator and as a mayor, I implemented several provisions that the UNCAC speaks about, including a merit-based public service, so that we passed a law called the Municipal Services Regulation, which gives tenure to municipal staff across the entire country. All municipalities have that. So you can't be fired. So municipal staff is treated the same way as public officers are treated. That's one of the things that we did while in government. And there were other things that we did, including auditing requirements, putting in place provisions that ensure that public funds are disclosed, that are transparent, putting all the tax rolls online. And these are things which, like, there are practices about it. So there's nothing that is new about UNCAC, because there are things that you can talk about it right away, and there are things that will you can do right away. So if you're in municipal government or central government, you could just follow a checklist and you could implement it. And when I was in government, we actually did that. The second thing, there's a lot of specific questions which were very important. The issue of the immigration. One of the things I think is important is appreciating a difference between political culture and economic culture. I think that immigrants who come to Belize have a very strong economic culture. I remember when we were, again, at City Hall, we worked with a lot of immigrant communities, and I saw that they are very hardworking. And there's a lot of people who come in this country and they are very, very hardworking. And I would hope that some Belizeans could adopt those values, so that the idea on immigrants is that I do agree that we need to have some sort of safety network for them. We need to have a rational immigration policy. We need to ensure that when they come in, they understand the basics of our electoral system. But I don't get the impression that immigrants are, one, not law abiding, and two, I don't get the impression that immigrants sell votes. I get the impression that when immigrants come to Belize, they tend not to be in the public fray because they don't want to be arrested or they don't want to whatever. But by and large, my experience with the majority of immigrants to this country, mainly people who come from Central America, have been that they are very, very hardworking. They have a very strong respect for authority, and they participate meaningfully in the political process. Should there be more education campaigns that are more geared towards them, to educate them more in terms of politics and why you vote and that kind of thing, and to incorporate them into Belizean life? Yes, but I think there are things too that we as Belizeans can learn from immigrants. I forgot a lot of the other comments or questions.
Mr. Bradley, I have one follow-up question. Well, you kind of sparked a thought when I was reflecting on the presentation thus far. You stated that you were impressed with the practice of the Muslim community earlier in the presentation, in terms of
impressed with the practice of
the Muslim community in
yes,
terms
yes.
of their ability to be able to recite the Quran.
Yes.
However, one would question, is it time that we, in speaking in terms of the separation of powers, church and state, is it time for us to do that? And if not, how do we go about integrating the value systems of those who do not share the Christian principles within the Constitution? Is it time that we integrate those into the preamble?
Okay, so good question. And one of the things, the reason why I mentioned that point was not necessarily on the point of religion, but on the point, the point that they internalize their belief system. Our religion is the Constitution. And what I'm saying is that citizens of Belize should go so far as memorizing the Constitution at the point when they're 5 years old. If we have that level of commitment to our Constitution and to the individual words of the Constitution, and if we reflect the Constitution in our orientation, we would have a much different society. So it wasn't on the point of religion, but it was the example to which they use that document, their document, to say that they internalize it as part of them, that we should do that same thing with our Constitution. I do believe for Belize that we should continue to be a church that is moral, a church that is, the Constitution talks about our belief in God, but I always say this, that God is an inclusive God, meaning that God is a lover of all people and all faiths and all orientations and all beliefs, political, economic, and all wise. So that when you look at the Constitution, and one of the things that I usually sometimes ask, would God support discrimination? No, God accepts everybody. And I don't believe that the Constitution speaks about a particular God. The Constitution is inclusive when it mentions belief in God and the supremacy of God, so that the Constitution is sufficient enough to incorporate Allah or Buddha or Jehovah or Jesus Christ. It's not a God, it is all faiths that the Constitution believes in. And the Constitution believes in inclusivity, pluralism, and non-discrimination. So that you have this notion in Belize of LGBTQI rights. That is something that the Constitution respects. It is not, and if people appreciate what the Constitution actually says, it's not that I have to promote that. It's not that I have to say that I promote one religion versus the other, but the Constitution and I have to believe in the principle of non-discrimination, the principle of plurality, that I have to agree and accept that all people, all faiths, all beliefs, all orientations can live and exist peacefully with dignity and respect within the space that we call believers. So that when you look at the Constitution, what the Constitution talks really about when it talks about morality is it talks about public morality or state morality, fairness and justice and equality. And these are principles that every single human being believes in. So the point that I was making there is that the Constitution actually doesn't talk about religion at all. And it doesn't talk about a particular religion. The only way that the Constitution speaks about religion is to say that there shall be freedom of religion, including that you can believe in no religion, or you can believe in anything that you want. But what the Constitution really promotes is tolerance and respect, including the respect for human dignity and the recognition that all persons have value and worth, regardless of their belief. And we should respect the value and input of all people in the establishment of our national identity and in our Belizean way of life.
All right, just getting to some comments here, Mr. Bradley again. Azer said, immigrants sell votes too. They're much smarter because they come for the land and other forms of wealth, while we Belizeans only care about the $50 or a quart. And so we wonder why regular Belizeans don't have a piece of land, right? I know God for the quart and I don't have a piece of land, just saying.
Oh gosh. Let me say this, right there. Let me say this just because I don't want to forget the question. If every Belizean, like in Barbados, you have what is called the Labour Party. And in the United Kingdom, you have the Labour Party. And Labour is king when those parties are in government, meaning that increase minimum wage and all different, because Labour is the political party. If we had a land rights party in Belize, meaning that there was a political party that was devoted to ensuring that every Belizean gets 1 acre of land, and that party won the government would do that. The reason why, and I go back to this point, politicians will do what people ask for. If people don't ask for anything, or if people sell their vote, that's what the politicians will do. I don't think that there has been any comprehensive land policy in this country, and there has certainly been nobody who's voting for that. And so that's why that hasn't been done.
Okay, and final comment, it's a very much so, Azer, but Mr. Bradley was right. Their work ethic is impeccable. Mr. Bradley, you have 20 more minutes. And
let me close down then, because I don't want to go over there. What I'll do is that I'll intersperse the comments with just the slide presentation, and it's very quick. I won't mention a lot of things in terms of the slide. Feel free to interject, because I prefer to use the 20 minutes for the comments and responding to questions rather than the slides. So stop me at any point and I'll break from the slide and I'll go back to your comments so that I make sure that I wrap up at 3:30. So 3:30 and we're done. So just getting back to the slide is that we eliminated the king, we killed the king, and we replaced it with our Belize constitution, or a constitution. And the fundamental thing in the constitution is to promote this notion of the rule of law. And what is that? That is that the constitution is supreme. The constitution is supreme rather than any government, rather than any king, or rather than any institution. It's for this reason that any citizen can sue the government. You could sue the prime minister, you could sue the commissioner of police, because we have the rule of law in our society rather than the rule of a monarch or a king. I mentioned the example of the US, and I talked about this before. I'll share the slide presentation so I won't get into this in terms of the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, both on their respect for individual rights and the rule of law, and also on this point of their ideological difference. That when I vote Democrat or when I vote Republican, I know the set of policies that they will implement. one of the things I'll put out to you is that how many of you could tell me the manifesto for any political party? I use the manifesto, our political party uses the manifesto, and you get vote with that. After the election, we throw away that. So the political party spoke about increasing the minimum wage. Where is that? We talked about, the UDP talked about UNCAC from 2008 in their manifesto. And they were in government from 2012 to 2022. They were in government for about 13 years and no law on UNCAC. And that was in their 2008 manifesto. I could show you that. So the point that I'm making is that there's a fundamental problem in our democratic system if we have a system that's not policy-based or ideological based. We have these manifestos, but really and truly they're meaningless. You cannot see the party implementing the manifesto after the election. So we have had the People's United Party in government for over a year, and where is the minimum wage? So both political parties, and I'm not saying any political parties, you can look at examples for both political parties that there is no policy that underpins the party, and there's no policy that they campaign on and that people vote for. So there's no land policy. So people don't get no land, can you not vote for that? There's no UNCAC policy, you didn't vote for that. What I'm saying is that you did not make, the people, you did not make your vote contingent on these manifestos. That's why they don't stick to it. Because in the next 5 years, they tell you the same manifesto again where they never implement, and you vote for the same thing. So what I'm saying is that if we could hold political parties to a set of predefined ideological or policy principles that they would be held to account for, meaning that at the next cycle, we don't vote for them if they don't pass that, then we'll have change. But we will not have change if we're not really tied in to this ideology or these policies. That's a fundamental flaw in our political system. One of the things that the Constitution establishes is this notion of the supremacy of the Constitution. So Clause 2 of the Constitution actually says that the Constitution is the supreme law of beliefs, and any other law is inconsistent to the extent of, is invalid to the extent of its inconsistency. So the Constitution sets itself up as the supreme law, and people can challenge other laws because of the constitutionality of it. The rule of law in the Constitution ingrains certain principles. Number one, the law has to be impartial. All laws have to be impartial. Number two, there has to be natural justice or fairness in the law. Number three, the law has to be certain so that everybody has to know the law and to be aware of the law. Number four, the law has to be enforced, and it has to be enforced equally. And number five, there has to be an independence of the judicial process. So the judiciary has to be independent. A fundamental principle of the Constitution is this notion of the separation of powers. So that when we define the Constitution, we define the Constitution as a system of checks and balances. That is what the Constitution is. The Constitution is a system of checks and balances. And the way that the Constitution is a check and balance, first and foremost, is that it separates the branches of government. So there's a separation between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And there's a system of checks and balances that creates limited government or divided government. The Constitution was actually created that way. So that what we did in Belize, we killed the king and we separated the king's power into 3 branches of government, but we did not kill the king completely. Meaning that in Belize, we have a flaw in our Constitution, and the Westminster parliamentary model that we follow have a flaw, meaning that there's a fused system with a powerful executive. And so in our system of government, the legislative branch and the executive branch is not separate. And the legislative branch and the executive branch, through their power, actually controls the judicial branch. So in our system of government, the executive is more powerful than the other branches of government. And so what I would say here is that this calls for political reform. There is a need to analyze the system on a regular basis to see that it is adequate, to ensure that there is the achievement of what the Constitution envisions, which is limited government. The Constitution was created to establish limited control government. The people did not want a king. The people wanted a government that was accountable and answerable to the people. And so what they did in the Constitution is that they broke up the governmental structure into 3 branches of government. That's specifically in the Constitution. But in the parliamentary system, we don't have that. In the parliamentary system, we still have a powerful executive. So there is a question there as to whether or not our system, the parliamentary system, is fundamentally flawed, and it promotes corruption because it promotes an ultra powerful executive, an ultra powerful prime minister, and an ultra powerful cabinet. In other countries of government, they have what is called the vote of no confidence. In the United Kingdom right now, there was a vote of no confidence in their Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and they're electing a new Prime Minister. They have gone through, this would be their 4th Prime Minister in about 3 years. So they had Theresa May, first they had David Cameron, he stepped down because of Brexit. They had Theresa May, she stepped down because of Brexit. Then they have Boris Johnson, and then they're now going to be a new Prime Minister. And this was all under the same conservative government. So the same government had a vote of no confidence, and they replaced 3 prime ministers to the point where now you're going to have 4 prime ministers in less than 3 years. That's a strong system of checks and balances, because this vote of no confidence actually works. In our government, if we have no confidence in the ruling government, the government would actually laugh at it. It would be a joke. But that could be a useful tool where we check the power of the government to take it back to the people or to take it back to the National Assembly to see whether or not there would be a renewed mandate. So when I talk about the idea of the Constitution and what the Constitution does is that the Constitution is a written law as the supreme law. The Constitution establishes beliefs and it sets out the boundaries of beliefs. The Constitution provides for a Bill of Rights and fundamental freedoms. What is this? These are fundamental rights and freedoms that every Belizean should have. This is part 2 of the Belize Constitution. So you have the right to life, liberty, and personal freedom and privacy, the right to own personal property, the right to due process of law, the right to bail, the right to natural justice. All of these rights are enshrined in the Belize Constitution. And these are rights that you don't have against individuals. So I don't have these rights against Beresford or against Brighton or against Philip. I have these rights against the government. So that the Bill of Rights itself is a limitation on governmental power. It tells you that these are things that the government cannot do. The government can't take your life. The government can't infringe on your right to privacy. But every time we hear GSU goes into people's houses without a search warrant and take you out your house middle of the night, when our Constitution expressly provides a right to privacy, including the right to the sanctity and the inviolability of your home, that the police can't go into your home without a warrant, but that right is violated. Why? Because we don't enforce or assert these rights. So the Constitution ascribes the Bill of Rights as being fundamental, as being very, very important, as being core to our national identity. And these rights only exist if we challenge them, if we take them to court, and if we hold the government to account. The Constitution creates the institutions of state, including that the Constitution creates the office of Governor General, the office of Prime Minister, the office of Leader of the Opposition. The Constitution creates the justices of the Supreme Court, the court structure. The Constitution creates the Director of Public Prosecution. And the Constitution says what these people's power would be, how they're appointed, and what they do within the constitutional system. So our Constitution is a system of checks and balances. The design, the purpose, the nature, the objective of the Constitution is to stop actions of government. That is what the Constitution is designed to. People in the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment age did not want a powerful government. They wanted government to be limited. They wanted checks and balances in their government. And they created a written constitution to limit the power of the government. including that they separated the powers of government so that not one person would have the 3 branches of government under their control. And they created the system of the rule of law, the division of government in the 3 branches of government, the vote, the fact that you vote for your elected official. One of the things I'll say here very quickly is that in analyzing this vote, you could look at the system of voting that we have. One of the things I want you to recognize, and I will finish in 8 minutes, is that we have different systems of government in Belize. At the central government level, you have what is called the first past the post system, where the country is divided into electoral divisions, and you only get to vote for the person in your electoral division. So that I don't vote for prime minister and I don't vote for people in other countries. So I may say I want more women in government, I want more young people in government, but I only get to vote for one person in the governmental system. That's actually a good system because it promotes representational government, that government is based on geography and every part of the country is equally represented. Another system of government is the proportional system of government, which we have at the city council level. So at the city council level, you vote for your mayor, but you get a party list. Within Belize City, if you're from Belize City, you get 10 candidates. If you're from out district, you get 6 candidates plus the mayor. And you get to vote for all 10 of those candidates if you're in Belize City, or all 6 candidates if you are out district. And so in that way, you could mix it up. You could say, well, I want to vote for all women candidates, or I want to vote for all young people. Or some people say, I don't vote for any incumbent. If you won for office already, I want to change the whole slate. So that one of the things that you can do is that we can keep our system of government, we could change to the proportional system of government, which many countries do have, where you have party lists. And research has shown that the proportional system of government tends to be more inclusive. It tends to include more young people and more women because the voter gets to vote for more people. In Belize City, I can vote for 10 candidates. So in the last municipal election, I wanted to vote for more women. So I voted for as much women as I could. If that were to be at the central government level and you wanted to support women, you get to vote for all the candidates who are women. Whereas under our current system at the central government level, you only get to cast for one vote. So I was in the Freetown area. My options were the Honorable Francis Fonseca and O.J. Ellington. So if I wanted to vote for a woman or a young person, I couldn't because my options were limited. Under the proportional system, you could have more options. So you could actually tinker with the vote to see how you would reform this. The Entrenched Services Commission. So one of the things that I think is a problem in our system is that we have eroded the public service. And we need to go back to a system where the public service is entrenched and is depoliticized. That does not require any change of the Constitution. But we need to ensure that the Constitution protects the public service and it makes sure that politicians cannot direct the public service. The government right now is proposing a constitutional amendment to change the appointment of commissioners of the public service to make it coincide with the electoral cycle. So when the prime minister gets in, the prime minister gets to nominate people for the Public Services Commission. That's wrong, that's terrible, because that will make this independent commission answerable to politics, when the design of the Constitution was the exact opposite, to make it independent. So we actually have constitutional proposals that will damage the Constitution and that will weaken the checks and balances. And then the last thing that I will mention and I will talk about with my last 4 minutes is the freedom of expression, which is a fundamental right and freedom in Belize, a right that we do not use responsibly and all too often. So this speaks to media involvement in government. This speaks to civic engagement, criticism of the public. So that one of the things that we should do is that we should openly criticize the government, whether or not we are supporting the government or opposing the government. People oftentimes say that, well, criticism is bad. If it's my government, then I will agree with what they will say. No, even if you are a supporter of the government, you should challenge the government. When the United Democratic Party was in government and I was in the government, I said no to policies of the United Democratic Party because I didn't believe in the policies. So that there was a point when they wanted to have a review of the immigration scandal. And they wanted that to be done by a commission of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And I said, no, that is not right, because many members of the House of Representatives would be named in that commission. So how would you have the fox governing the chicken? How would you have members of the House of Representatives be on part, or their colleagues be on a commission when that commission is looking into actions that they did? That's wrong. And I spoke out against that. And we need to develop a culture of people who express their opinions openly. Criticism, politics, political dialogue, disagreement, we tend to think these are curse words in beliefs. We tend to think that it's a problem to criticize. We tend to think that we want to be polite and not disagreeable. But our constitution creates a system, and it requires that the citizen be open, objective, and critical of their government, of any government. So that one of the things that I've tried to do this afternoon is that I've tried not to talk about any particular government. I believe that our system of government is flawed. I believe that both political parties are flawed. And I believe that reform needs to be done, but that reform needs to be a combination of reforming the culture of leadership and a paradigm shift, reforming the attitude and culture of the individual, including that there has to be a promotion of civic engagement in our education system, and then tailored actual policy reforms and legislative reforms at the policy level to change the constitution and our subsidiary laws. My time is 3:29, and that is my presentation.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bradley, for your enlightening conversation. I want to thank everybody who was here. This is a part of our Constitution 101 webinar series. It's the offer insight on what our Constitution is and charting the way forward in the People's Constitution Commission, Constitution Commission, which is talking about reforming the Constitution. But we thought it, the core members of YLAB thought it important that we let you have a basic understanding of what the Constitution is, what it encapsulates, and what we will quintessentially be reforming. And so that is why, so to have you engaged as we go about, because one of the responsibilities of having a seat on the PCC is that we ought to consult you guys and to have consultations. And so in order to have meaningful consultation, we thought it important for us to educate. And Mr. Bradley, thank you for your insightful conversations. Of course, you shared some very valuable gems for us to consider as we chart the way forward in our individual discussion as YLAB. Brighton.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for taking the time out of your schedule to be able to share with us insights on the Constitution and the makeup of the Constitution, and for providing us with some of your proposals and recommendations. Certainly, we take knowledge that we've garnered throughout our conversation, and we continue to engage our members as we begin to chart our way into this, what we task a generational task, as we continue to move forward with the reformation of Belize's Constitution. Critical for us going forward, reforming the supreme law of the land. So thank you again, Mr. Bradley. To all our members, please stay abreast of notifications that may be coming into your email. We will be sending out timely notifications for new developments. We have been invited, like has been shared, to strategically work with the Department of Youth Services on their revision of their strategy. And also we have already published as you may be seeing on the different news media outlets, that we are represented at the People's Constitution Commission by Ms. Alia Gomez, attorney at law, and our alternate Mr. Mandela Wade. Stay tuned for other upcoming activities as we continue to engage young people in national development and participative inclusion in development spaces.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I just want to say a quick thank you to Mr. Bradley. You know, we've been in contact for the last 2 weeks trying to make it happen. We're looking forward to continued engagement with you, as you are somebody who, when we pitched the name to the young people, everybody was excited. You see the level of engagement, and of course, you know, the continued interest will be there. Like Brighton said, we have a significant opportunity now to be directly involved in the process. We have been engaging in house committees prior to the Constitutional Commission, but it's great now to actually have a seat where we can channel our comments directly through our representative. We're looking forward to building out the team. We have important developments coming up with the development of our committee, our Constitution Reform Committee, who will be working to solicit positions and consolidate positions from wider membership to our representatives, because it's key for us to understand that when our representatives go on these commissions and attend these meetings, they'll be attending on behalf of YLAB. We're over 250 members now, Mr. Bradley, so we're growing quite well within the first 2 weeks of publicly launching. So we look out for the continued participation of members. We look out for their direct input into the process, and we will continue with the education process. We have some exciting seminars coming up. We're going to be looking at the 2001 reform process that happened, what went right, what went wrong, the continued amendments that happened since 2001, and, you know, completing the picture and framing it to show where we go from there and where young people fit in that picture. So guys, thanks a lot for your time. Mr. Bradley, thanks a lot once again, and let's keep in touch. Let's continue to grow together.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys for everything.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Bradley. Have a good afternoon, everybody.